So, Tim, thank you very much for joining us. For those that don't know, Tim G is I think the most exciting thing really is the incoming General Secretary of FWCC in January 2022. So that's Friends World Committee for Consultation, which is kind of like the Quaker world body. So that's going to be a very exciting chapter for you coming up, Tim. But Tim's also worked for Christian Aid, Amnesty, Friends of the Earth. He also worked for Quakers of Britain, helping to set up the sanctuary project there. He's written 3 books so far, possibly 4, depending. I don't know if you've finished your 4th yet. Counter Power, Making Change Happen. You Can't Evict an Idea, What Can We Learn from Occupy? Why I'm a Pacifist, A Call for a Non-Violent World. And he's got a book coming out soon, which is Open for Liberation, An Activist Reads the Bible. So incredibly appropriate to our conversation tonight. I don't think that's necessarily why we asked you, but it's serendipitous timing in many ways. And it leads me to my first question, which is, have you always seen the Bible as a useful kind of tool to drive your own activism, as an inspiration, or has that shifted over time too?
Hello. Well, thank you for the introduction, and hello everyone, people I know and people I don't. I've probably been an activist for about 20 years, since 2001, since the attack on the Twin Towers, and then the attack that followed on Afghanistan and on Iraq. And that both of those just seemed so, well, all of those seemed so obviously wrong. If killing people was wrong in the United States, then it was wrong in other countries. And that was really my introduction into activism. And I guess for the last 2 decades, I've probably spent more time kind of involved in campaigns than doing almost anything else. And towards the beginning of that, the Bible and religion more broadly was probably not explicitly part of how I saw myself. I was campaigning in community with other young friends, so it was there. But there's been a real change to now, which is, I would say that the Bible's absolutely central to my understanding of the world, and it's one of the things that keeps me going and keeps me engaged and kind of reassures me within a power to continue. Yeah, I studied international politics because I wanted to understand about the world and how to change it, and I specialised in the environment and human rights and African politics. And I suppose those have told me something about the world, but they haven't told me a great deal about myself and how to keep going. And I think my other hesitation with the kind of social scientific way of seeing the world is that most of the time it doesn't allow for a divine presence in the course of world history, or indeed in people's hearts. It kind of censors that out for the most part. And now in my work, I see that as absolutely central. So I think there were 2 turning points, if I'm going to zone in on 2 moments in that 20 years. So one, when I was 19, I was in Palestine doing some peace work there. And I was with other young people, most from across the world, but also Palestinian young people who were staying in Jericho. And I brought the Bible with me. And I read Matthew and the Sermon on the Mount. I got to the end of Matthew, and it just seemed incredibly relevant. It was to do with young people trying to work out how to be in a world which is violent, how to create change. There were different kind of factions, both in the biblical culture and in modern Palestine. And yeah, it seemed to describe a search for trying to work out how to bring about peace and justice in the world as it is. The second one was in my 20s. I'd written my first book, Counter Power, and I toured that around the United States, staying with friends as I went, which was very nice. I was actually, by the official definition, I was actually homeless at that point. It was the time of the Olympics. There was a rent crisis in London. I couldn't afford to carry on with my house that I'd been illegally evicted from. So there was all kinds of things going on within me. I traveled around the United States, staying with friends, and went to the Philadelphia meeting, Arch Street meeting. And as part of that, I felt a powerful experience within myself, which was a connection of feeling love and light and realizing that that connected me with the whole of humanity. And that was a really ecstatic experience. And when I read about George Fox, realizing that there was an ocean of love and light which goes over the other forms, then I think I sense that I maybe get what he was feeling like. And when I came back, I officially joined the Society of Friends, but I also just wanted to know a lot more about the Bible, a lot more about religion. I went to my local library and sat next to the shelf on religion and slowly worked my way through it. And I found a way to engage with the Bible where it wasn't just about politics and social change. It was about people experiencing God in different ways and kind of feeling part of a community that has existed for millennia, where people have had experiences like this, where people have experienced God. That really has deepened me in my faith, and it's been very important to me ever since.
Thank you for sharing that, and lots of potential jumping off points and follow-up questions. What I find interesting about what you've said there is there was something that came up in a lot of things, which is around the world in terms of both, I think, sort of meaning it in a kind of loose sense of the world around us, but also a kind of global sense. In your mind, do you see the Bible as a global text, or do you think it's applicable to a specific location, or does it relate to a particular background of your own?
Well, most of it occurs in a particular area of the world, although across several countries of it. And I think it really helped that I was in that country when I really decided to, or in that area of the world, should I say, when I decided to really engage with it, because it really helped me immerse myself in it and imagine it and feel it. But the message of the Bible is that it's universal to all people everywhere. And that seems to be the case. There are people inspired by the Bible in every country of the world. So I do think that it's global. I think there is something that both of those experiences that I had were when I was taken out of my familiar experience of my own country. And I think there is something about when we remove ourselves from the labels and expectations and personalities that people in our immediate environment impose upon us. When we're in a new environment, we can sometimes be a little bit more open to kind of divine insight or the reality which is within, rather than what's imposed upon us. I think there's a little bit of that in George Fox. I think there's a little bit of that where he's, he spends time walking in the Midlands and in the north of England, where he's having his revelatory experiences. And of course, Jesus spends time, in the wilderness. When he really wants to think, when he really wants to connect with God, he often takes himself out of his immediate environment. And those are things that I identify with.
One of the things that I have found recently that I perhaps had an appreciation of, but perhaps not to the same extent as I do now, is that Quakers actually tend to read the Bible in a slightly different way to other traditions. And you're referencing there a lot about Fox, and you talked about doing things with friends or Quakers from a very early age. When you think about the Bible from the context of growing up, were you always approaching it, do you think, from a Quaker perspective, or has that changed over time? And do you have any other influences in how you engage with the Bible?
Yeah, so my mum was educated at a Quaker school, and in her Quaker school, the head of RE believed that children shouldn't be taught the Bible because they would his theory was that they would imbibe then a childlike interpretation that would then ruin it for them when they became adults. So then they'd have to kind of unlearn all of the simplistic things that they'd learned as children so that they could learn it as adults. And he believed, well, better don't teach them as children, better just create an environment where there are good values. And then when people are ready for it, they'll find it. And I think that's the approach that my mum took with me, which is quite a surprising approach, probably. And I'm not sure how sustainable an approach it is in the long term, but it did work for me. In these two stories that I've shared with you about what happened in Palestine and what happened in Philadelphia, those are very important to me. Those have become a very strong part of my kind of personal narrative, my story I tell myself. And I'm always delighted when I find kind of bits of evidence that disrupt it. So I was recently going through some old school topic textbooks, and there was loads of Bible stories that we learned where I'd drawn pictures. We did a topic on animals, and I wrote a Bible story about Daniel in the lion's den, or whatever. We were given the Gideon's Bible at school, which it's very well thumbed now. I like the fact it fits in a pocket. If I'm walking places, I often take it with me. And I did read bits of that when I was given it. And I do remember in my late teens reading the whole of the book of Mark in one sitting and really enjoying that. So I think there were the foundation stones kind of being created for me. But kind of, it was almost as if they were like sitting on top of my heart. My heart hadn't opened for them to like fall into it yet. They were just sitting there. So I maybe had some familiarity, some knowledge, but I wouldn't describe anything I had as being kind of understanding. Yeah, you mentioned Quaker approaches. I think the way that I've approached the Bible, it's kind of cycled through different approaches. So at first I was kind of drawn by the most obvious approach, maybe called like the text-based approach, where you kind of read what's on the page and that's it. And, reading the Sermon on the Mount, if the world was ordered according to Sermon on the Mount, the world would be a lot better. If everyone acted according to the Sermon on the Mount, the world would be a lot better. And I kind of followed this kind of Tolstoyan idea that, it's very clear what it says, we should all do that. I think some of my hesitations with that approach across the Bible is, of course, there are other parts of the Bible that don't seem to, on the surface of it, join up with the message of the Sermon on the Mount. So what do we do with that? And then also kind of looking at different interpretations. So some of the, that begins with the Beatitudes, blessed are the poor. In some of the more disappointing translations, that's translated as happy are the poor. And then in some of the more radical translations, where it's translated from the Greek back into the Aramaic, then back into English, there's an idea that comes across a bit more like rise up and take action, the poor. So I can't just take a text-based approach where the same text could mean happy are the poor, they're there, be happy with it. Or on the other hand, could mean rise up and take action. So then I got very interested in the kind of historical critical approaches, the kind of who wrote what, when, why, who edited it, who translated it, what were their agendas, how does it link up with the archaeological evidence, blah, blah, blah. I found that really exciting, endlessly fascinating, but ultimately quite disappointing, because the attempts that there are to kind of sum up the scholarly consensus at the moment are, well, we can't really be sure. That's quite a disappointing outcome. Doesn't feel, even though it feels on the surface of it like a quest for truth, it's all in the head, it's not enough in the heart. So now I take an approach which I think is maybe something more like what might be described as a Quaker approach, a kind of reader-focused approach that says, if I read the Bible and I have a certain response to that, that is true to me. If I read somebody else's response, then that's true to them. And that's kind of in a lot of the feminist approaches and anti-racist approaches and liberation approaches and so on take that approach. And it also seems in line with that idea of George Fox again, saying, you will say that Jesus says this and the apostles say this, but what canst thou say? So I feel like the reader-focused approach or the reader-oriented approach has something in common with what I think George Fox was trying to get across in that particular phrase.
Yeah, that parallel of sort of living the Bible as opposed to sort of reading it out over here. There's something that interests me in what you've said, which is you in your answer to the first question, you talked about the Bible being quite reassuring, and you've also spoke about how it was, well, the impression I got was almost easy to read when you were a teenager, which is very different to my experience and the experience of some Quakers. So I just kind of wanted to, yeah, to kind of unpack that a little bit more. Do you want to respond to that, or do you want a more specific question?
Well, I think it wasn't in my heart when I was a teenager. I think I read, in fact, I distinctly remember that I must have been a very kind of earnest teenager. I think one evening I read Henry IV Part 1, and then I read Henry IV Part 2, and then I read Mark. I was just kind of like working my way through kind of what I had come to believe were the kind of important texts that I probably should have read in order to have some kind of cultural competency in my own culture. I think they weren't in my heart at that point. It was just, oh, that's a book, that's interesting. So I think it was easier because I wasn't asking so much of it. Whereas now, you know, I need some sustenance to keep going. I'm kind of aware that there's these spiritual change makers through history, this message of hope over millennia in the Bible. And as a spiritual change maker now, you know, I feel encouraged by those people who carried on going in the face of adversity. So I think that's some of the ways that it consoles me now.
That sort of sense of yeah, being part of something and using something that has inspired others, perhaps, is then you're sort of drawing from that same well. I guess that's fair to say. You have mentioned the Sermon on the Mount, you mentioned Matthew, you mentioned Mark. Is your relationship with the Bible focused around specific parts of it? Is there sections of the Bible that really speak to you? Are there sections that you haven't really explored or you find problematic?
So I think for a long time I've been a lot more focused on the New Testament than the Hebrew Scriptures. And 2 or 3 years ago, I even had a go at doing a full paraphrasing in my own words of the New Testament. And I wrote to a publisher and asked them, would you publish this? And they said yes. And then I decided that wasn't such a good idea. There's plenty of perfectly good translations and paraphrasings of the Bible without me adding to them. So that ended up being essentially a kind of spiritual exercise for me. But then, you know, I figured, actually I was doing this on a train in Germany, and in very broken German with a little bit of English, someone opposite me asked me what I was doing, and I explained, and they said, are you going to do the Hebrew Scriptures too? And I said no, and they said, well, you really should. And I was like, yeah, I really should. And I wasn't able to paraphrase the whole thing. So at the beginning of lockdown, the first lockdown, I tried reading and or listening to the whole of the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. And that really deepened my experience of it. And you asked me kind of, are there bits that I keep coming back to? And I suppose anytime that I find something that on the surface of things doesn't seem to be in line with the golden rule of do unto others as you would have done unto yourself, or the broader spirit of the Sermon on the Mount, then I figure that I have to sit with it until I find an interpretation that does. So whilst it's the golden rule in the Sermon on the Mount that I keep going back to, kind of as the lens through which I engage with the rest of the Bible, now I'm able, kind of, certain events will prompt me to kind of want to revisit one part or another of the Bible in more detail.
Interesting. You talk about the Bible in a very kind of like positive way, and obviously it's something that's deeply important to you, and as you say, it resonates with people all around the world. So I'm going to slide slightly more into devil's advocate. I mean, how does it make you feel if that also the Bible is arguably being cited and used to perpetuate the type of things that your career would have been the opposite of what you've been trying to do? And if you sort of take the view that everybody kind of have their own reading of it, how does that sit with you when some people will, use the Bible to justify war, or to restrict people's liberty, or as justification for, for the type of things that in your career working with Amnesty and Christian Aid and Friends of the Earth perhaps wouldn't resonate with you?
Well, yeah, the Bible has been used in the oppression of women, in the justification of slavery, and all kinds of things. And Quakers through the centuries have used the Bible to argue against slavery and against the oppression of women, and so on. And I'm excited that this is a common vocabulary book. So in this time when we're kind of increasingly polarized, these culture wars, the idea that there is, at least with some people, a common vocabulary book, a way that we can connect, I find quite exciting. And I think that's something that we could do a lot more. Yeah, I mean, when I did this full cover, I've spent a lot of time on Matthew and on James, and on Revelation. I've spent a lot less time on kind of Kings and Samuel and Chronicles. And in some of these books in the middle of the Bible, they're really hard to read. There are really extreme abuses and injustices that are perpetrated and are described in quite graphic detail, kind of chopping up of people's bodies and sending them to different parts of the kingdom, kind of chopping off of enemies' foreskins and the setting light of foxes' tails, and kind of serious sexual violence being perpetrated, especially against women. And I work for a human rights organization. I work for Amnesty International. Yeah. This kind of thing is not abstract. This is the kind of thing that we work with. So how do I sit with that in our sacred book? And that was a question I asked myself when I got there. I kind of really felt the pain of these extreme injustices being described in this book that's so important to me. And it's borrowed from Augustine, actually. Augustine said, if anything doesn't lend towards the rule of charity, then you've got to meditate on it until it does. And that's the approach that I take. So got to meditating for quite a while. And it occurred to me, and I'm not the first person to argue this, but from my reader-focused view, what if we read these passages as if they are the genre of like a human rights report? They're being written down so that we know about them, so that we don't repeat them. And that fits with, once you get to the prophets, the Hebrew scriptures mostly came together in the 8th century, and then were compiled during the exile in Babylon. So it's very possible that people in Babylon who'd been exiled from their own countries, from their own homeland, were writing a history, kind of like an official inquiry, to say, here are some things that we did wrong that we're going to make sure that we don't repeat. So I think, what I do is I engage with these things and I sit with them until an interpretation comes through, which leans towards the rule of charity.
We're skimming through section 2 and pushing in, and I'm quite keen for us to give people a chance. So if you've got questions, get them ready, okay? If you've got anything you want to ask, otherwise, I mean, I'll keep grilling Tim otherwise. My last question that I wanted to ask you was, do you think the Bible is, how do you feel about there are some friends within Britain Uni Meeting who are sort of mourning the loss of the Bible as a central text for liberal modern Quakers, and then there are others who are quite happy to see the back of it. How do you feel about that? Do you think Quakers, is that just something that's happening and it's sort of, it's the way of the world? Do you think Quakers would be poorer spiritually if we were to have less centered understanding of the Bible within our Quaker communities in this country?
I followed this debate on the letters page of The Friend, as I imagine other friends in Britain may well have done. And I think it's polarized in a very unhelpful way, as if there are some Quakers who do activism and there are some Quakers that do faith. And, you know, James answers this. He says, faith is dead without works. You know, action is part of faith, faith is part of action. Because he continues, but if you only do works and you don't have faith, then that doesn't work either. So, you know, this has already been answered in the 1st century AD, where it sounds like there may have been, I don't know if it was an identical debate, but it's resolved 2 millennia ago. And I feel like the way that it's sometimes framed, it's as if there are 2 groups criticizing each other. There's one group saying, oh, you know, maybe people might saying kind of, oh, you know, don't shove this Christianity down our throats. And then there's another group saying, you know, oh no, you're bad because you're not like, you're taking away the Christianity of our faith. And I don't think that's helpful. I think that if you're excited about the Bible and if you're excited about faith, then express that and share that and kind of enthuse people for it. Don't criticize people, enthuse people for it. Share the good news. I think that's a far more effective and joyful and constructive route to maintaining and building on the biblical foundations of our faith than criticizing some people who it doesn't work for yet.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions they want to put in the chat or would like to ask Tim by raising their hand? You don't have to, but I'm more than happy to welcome any questions. Well, as far as I can see, people are thinking.
Does that mean I get to ask you a question?
If you want.
So how has the Bible changed in your life? Because I think the last time we had a long conversation about it was about 5 years ago. You've since worked for Woodbrook. So has working for Woodbrook changed your engagement with the Bible?
I think so. So my story around the Bible is I was raised in the Church of England, and so it was, you know, colour in Noah's Ark and all of that type upbringing. Happened to be the sort of the understanding of the Bible that was imposed to me. And here's this important document, and you know, we're going to engage with these stories in this sort of very Sunday school kind of way. And I remember reading it as a teenager and thinking, well, what I know about the history of both the Catholic Church and the Church of England doesn't look at all like what I'm reading here, particularly the New Testament. And then the Old Testament, I just disagree fundamentally with a lot of it. So that was kind of the catalyst actually for me leaving the Church of England. And then I guess with Quakers, I've kind of given me the strength to maybe look at it again and kind of think, oh, maybe there is something here. And I would say in the last 5 years, that's definitely changed this understanding that, yeah, the insights of other people and talking to people like yourself, also, you know, conversations with people who are using the Bible in really interesting ways has opened me up to thinking, oh, maybe this is a valuable text, and it's kind of given me the tools to kind of approach it from different angles. So it's definitely changed a lot. So yeah. Felicity, I see you've got your hand raised. Do you want to ask a question? Unmute yourself. Go for it.
I think you're on mute, Felicity.
Ooh. We're getting there.
It'll be in the bottom left, probably. There we go.
Yes, sorry. Yes, I was interested when you mentioned that you need to read the Bible for your own sustenance. I was wondering how you might build that into your daily life. You know, I mean, and if there's periods in your life where, you know, you've struggled in your own faith, where it's, you know, it's difficult to get the sustenance, how you manage to maintain it. I don't know if you can share anything about that.
Yeah, I think I can. So I suppose the Hebrew Bible kind of came together in something like a recognizable form during the time of the exile. So the whole Hebrew Bible is about maintaining faith of a return, even when people have been kind of kicked out of their homeland. Much of the New Testament around Jesus and the apostles is about kind of surviving under Roman occupation. And then by the time of Revelation, probably that's kind of after the sack of Jerusalem in 70 CE. So like a huge amount of it is about kind of maintaining hope, and especially like the letters, especially letters of Paul, of James, of Peter, they all start by saying you're going to have lots of trials and tests sent your way, and if you can deepen in the faith through them, then you'll come out stronger. So I read all of those, but I feel a bit like that at the moment. I'm physically in London, but I'm aware that world leaders are currently in Glasgow. I used to live in Scotland. I've been a climate activist most of my adult life. It doesn't look like there's really going to be a kind of world-saving outcome out of this. So how do I maintain hope of a beloved community, a kingdom of heaven, a world where people, which is structured based around kind of decency and keeping one another alive? And I find some encouragement in the opening of the Bible, the reassurance that God loves the world. I find some reassurance in Revelation, where there's all kinds of environmental themes, kind of river pollution and heat, and there's even a kind of a key that's found where kind of smoke comes out of the shafts of the earth and blocks out the sun, which sounds a lot like global warming. But the message of that is that the kingdom of heaven, the rule of Jesus, a social order whereby we treat one another with dignity and respect will come out of that. And that encourages me. You know, a lot of non-religious people will be looking at Glasgow right now saying, well, nothing's going to save us short of a miracle. Whereas a faithful person can look at what's happening at Glasgow and say, okay, then let's work for a miracle. Let's work in partnership with God for this better world, which the whole of the scriptures reassure to us is what God wants. That gives me hope.
Thank you.
Ruth, you've got a question in the chat, but I can also see you've raised your hand. Do you want me to read your question, or do you want to say it?
No, I'm happy to say it. I took ages to find the raise the hand bit, so that's why I put it in the chat. I wanted to know, do you always read and study the Bible alone, Tim, or does your meeting have a Bible study group? And if it does, do you use the Bible Quaker reading method that I learned at Woodbrook from Rex Ambler? Thank you.
Yeah. We don't have a Bible study group at Peckham Meeting. We do have a wonderful, there's 2 people on the call from Peckham Meeting. We do have a wonderful series where people share their spiritual journeys one by one, which has been absolutely wonderful. It's not Bible study. I've been tremendously helped and strengthened by courses at Woodbrook, especially those which have shared things about the early Quakers and their interpretations of the Bible. But I think it can be tempting after going on these studies, on these courses, to go, okay, well, George Fox said this and Margaret Fell said this, so this is the Quaker view. Whereas what I take from the way that they interpreted the Bible is they kind of demonstrate a reading strategy. They demonstrate an idea of an immersive reading where they kind of read it within, where they kind of have their own interpretations, and sometimes kind of interpretations which are quite a long way from what on the surface of things might be going on. So Margaret Fell arguing that the exile, as well as being a historical, the Exodus, as well as being a historical event, could represent the journey of the inner light out of the prison of the heart out into the world, and so on. So I've been certainly strengthened by various Woodbrook courses. I haven't used the method explicitly that you refer to.
Do feel free to ask any follow-up questions if you want, Ruth. There is a question in the chat from Beth, and it says, what translation do you find helpful? Personally, I find John Henson's translation of the New Testament good as new.
Good, I'll have to look that up. I think I tend to swap between 3 different ones. King James Version for familiarity, also the New International Version for familiarity, but by far and away my favourite is the New Living Translation. It's very clear. I think there are some translations that kind of lean towards passivity, and I think the New Living Translation doesn't do that. But my favourite way of engaging with the Bible is, it's actually on Spotify. There is a hip-hop New Living Translation, which is just really brilliant. I mean, especially the letters, the ones where they're in the first person. You know, hip hop is the music of a marginalized minority suffering under the oppression of racial capitalism, the modern empires, and the letters of the New Testament were the testimony of the Jesus following Jews who were suffering on the margins of the empire of their day. So kind of having that link, I think, really reminds me of that link, that these are the words of the marginalized, offering social commentary and inward, expressing themselves, their inward selves towards a more just world. And it's also kind of quite well done. It's also, you know, these ones, you know, they're fantastic. They fit in your pocket, but sometimes, you know, it's so small. Sometimes if I'm a bit tired, you know, it takes quite a lot of energy to kind of read the small writing and really engage with it. Whereas putting on headphones, listening to the hip hop translations, so the New Living Translation with a hip hop beat, it just really kind of allows kind of covering quite a lot of ground, really surrounding yourself in it, immersing yourself in it. So that's the one that I enjoy the most.
And some fascinating stuff for us to look up. I find that I quite enjoy Googling passages and seeing lots of different translations of the same thing side by side.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting. So yeah, it's curious, as you say, the passivity and action, call to action in different versions. I don't see at the moment we don't necessarily have any questions, so I'm going to ask another question because that's why I'm here. You talk about the Bible as something that you know gives you hope for things like COP. You've mentioned things like Revelation there. It's a slightly cliche question maybe, but you talk about it as if you have a real belief in what it says and the truth there. And I just kind of wanted to push you a little bit on that. And also like, how does that sit for you with kind of that constant Quaker debate about sort of universalism and different faith perspectives and different books? And is it just that the Bible happens to speak to you and there's truth in other places, or for you is that the truth?
Yeah. Maybe I'll do the second part of that first. I would like to read as many books of world religion as I can. It's taken me quite a long time to get through the Jewish and Christian core texts. But that Christianity is what, 1 billion? Is that right? Anyway, so a large proportion of the world are Christian. So we have and very many different types. So I feel like that helps me connect with many different people around the world. And of course, many different Quaker communities around the world where we speak many different languages but share the Bible. Of course, elements of Islam kind of are based on biblical themes. Obviously, there's the connection with Judaism. Aspects of Rastafarianism. So, already through this, this text that fits in the pocket, or maybe that one, that's 4 world faiths that we're kind of learning something more about. On the truth of it, I think this is one of my questions with the historical critical approach. So there appears to be very little archaeological evidence for the Exodus. That many people in that desert for that amount of time might have left behind more remains. And maybe they were just very good at picking up their litter. But the kind of archaeological consensus is that the story of the Exodus as it's written in the second book of the Bible maybe isn't how it happened. So how, as a Quaker, can I engage with this in terms of truth? I think my answer is that this story creates history in our own time. So Harriet Tubman's nickname was Moses, and Martin Luther King often talked about his movement, or the movement he was part of, using stories from Moses about walking out of slavery and towards the promised land. Albert Luthuli called his memoir "Let My People Go," and Ralph Abernethy, a close friend of Martin Luther King, called his "The Walls Come Tumbling Down." So these stories create truth and create justice and create history, and are still creating history. So there is a truth in them that many people desire to escape from circumstances of oppression towards circumstances of justice, and feel an inner push, an inner pull, an inner leading to do so. So I think that there are multiple levels of truth within the Bible, far beyond what kind of archaeology and secular history can really deal with.
Thank you. One of the interesting things that you asked me earlier about sort of what's changed for me in the last 5 years is a conversation with a number of Quaker Bible scholars, and particularly the one that springs to mind is Peterson Toscano, and how the Bible is almost like contradicts itself intentionally and revises itself. And so he talks a lot about the example of how eunuchs are initially treated as almost subhuman, and then by the time you get further into the Bible, God is almost appearing before eunuchs. Jesus' interaction with that. Do you have do you engage with that kind of idea as well around truth, that actually like the Bible almost is layered on top of each other, and it's not an issue that contradicts itself?
Yeah, I think if you think of it as commenting upon itself rather than contradicting itself, then I think that helps with that one. I mean, sometimes people say to me, well, do you believe that Jesus was a real person? One of my answers is, if I was going to fabricate Jesus, I'd do a much better job of my witness statements. I'd make them all join up. Because, there are 4 Gospels and they all have slightly different accounts, including in some kind of quite fundamental things and also in some kind of quite important details. And, one of the criticisms is, well, does this, get your story right? Well, I've been to watch a good number of court cases, especially when nonviolent activists are on trial, and different witnesses do give slightly different accounts of events, but it's still clearly the same event that they're talking about. So I think the other thing that I like is that because you do get, so in the Gospels, you get your 4 Gospels that all have slightly different accounts. In the books of Moses in the Old Testament, there's a theory that there are 4 different authors and they're all kind of smooshed together right from the start, where there's 2 creation narratives right next to each other. And what this does is it affords respect to the reader to say, we're respecting you to work this out for yourself. And I really like that. I find Paul really interesting as well. You mentioned before about passages that are used to oppress, and sometimes these are lifted from Paul. But Paul comments on different parts of the Bible as well. So there's a section where he talks about one of Moses' commandments that an ox in the field should be able to eat some of the grass as it goes, which seems to be like, okay, well, that's nice, good for the animals. But Paul says, but of course, he's also not just talking about animals, of course, he's talking about humans as well. We should have some of the fruits of our labor as well. And yeah, that's not entirely obvious. He's not contradicting the commandment of Moses, he's commenting on it. And he's giving us an example of how sometimes texts can have meanings that aren't immediately obvious. And I feel like that's also an invitation to us to ask, okay, well, what other texts might have meanings that are not immediately obvious to us? And yeah, Peterson Toscano is one of the many who kind of take that invitation and bring a reader-focused approach. He's a queer person, and he says, this is my experience of the Bible as a queer person. And for those of us who are not queer, myself included, I think we can deepen our understanding by reading the accounts of people who have experiences of the world that we don't share.
Thank you. We've got a comment and a question in the chat from Beth again. I like the imaginative way of reading gospel stories in which I see myself taking part in the story, picturing the scene, imagining the feelings of different people in it, what they say or what they do. Is this something you've tried? And there's another comment here, so I'll read it at the same time. I find Psalms particularly helpful in times of sadness and despair. Out of the depth I have cried to you, O God, and why are you so heavy, O my soul, etc.
Yeah. So on the first one, that's certainly how I read the New Testament. There's I've spent a lot of time on demonstrations, and I've been to a lot of rallies, and the idea that some of the principal characters in the New Testament are challenging the status quo of their days and potentially giving speeches or giving words to be read out by others. I imagine myself listening to those as if I were kind of in the audience at a protest, because that's an experience that I can identify with. I've spent a lot of time doing court support, both in my work with Amnesty International and in other situations, going and sitting in court when nonviolent activists are on trial. There are a good few trials, including in the New Testament, of Jesus, for example, also of Peter. These are not really what we might consider free and fair trials, especially in the case of Jesus. But yeah, I sometimes when I'm on the way to those things, I read those relevant passages in the Bible. So as well as me kind of reading my own experience into the Bible, I also then kind of bring those stories of the Bible into that work for social justice that I engage with. Yeah, I also like the Psalms. I like Psalm 1 very much. And one of the methods that I've sometimes used for Bible studies to read Psalm 1 and kind of go into a bit of silence. So kind of using that to kind of center me ahead of reading a passage, and then kind of as if in a Quaker meeting, kind of waiting to see what words come up, as if like ministry, and then writing those down. So yes, I'm pro the Psalms.
Ruth's question seems to be related to Beth's perhaps, and it says, and with that, have you used, sorry if I butcher this, Lectio Divina, as well as Indignation Imaginative Approach?
So I have not used Lectio Divina. I've come across it in Woodbrook courses on the Bible, and it's not an approach that, as I understand it, Lectio Divina is about focusing on kind of one or two sentences or a small passage, and I've tended to kind of go for a different approach of just kind of diving into the whole lot and kind of letting it surround me and kind of letting it kind of going into my heart and see what happens. So I haven't done that one so far, but I have read some results of other people using that approach, which are absolutely fascinating. I don't know about the Ignatian imaginative approach, so I'd love to know more.
It's the first book that was well known for that is Gerard Hughes' God of Surprises, and it's the Jesuit approach to reading the Bible, and it's basically what Beth has described, and easy to learn at many Catholic retreat houses that on a Jesuit tradition, like St. Bino's. But it is that you can do it on your own, but it's even more wonderful if somebody leads you through it, and it leads you through it. So an imaginative meditation, but using the Bible and hearing Jesus speak to you that way, or identifying where you are in the picture. If it's the pool at Bethesda, are you one of the pillars, or are you actually a person? That kind of, where exactly are you? Yes.
Great. I'll find out more about that. Thank you.
Yes, God of Surprises is the place to, in my opinion, is the place to start. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if it's kind of similar to what Beth was talking about, a lot of my work at the moment is to do with defending the right to protest, including with the policing bill. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about the Jesus' entry into Jerusalem, which must have seemed a bit like a protest with people shouting Hosanna, which means something like save us or rescue us or even liberate us. And I've imagined myself as one of the people in the crowd going, liberate us, as Jesus comes in through one gate on a donkey, kind of maybe mirroring the pageantry of the rulers who might have come through a different gate on a fine horse. So that's kind of one way that I've imagined myself into that story that's very important to me with the work that I'm doing at the moment. Along with many other Quakers, I've been doing a lot of thinking about power and privilege and race and racism and racial injustice and so on over recent years. And I've always imagined myself kind of going into the temple with Jesus and being one of the people that overturned the tables. And one of the things that I've been doing more recently is, well, what if I'm not one of the people who comes in with Jesus and overturns the tables, kind of in a bit of a kind of disruptive protest? What if I'm like one of the stall holders? You know, how would I cope if Jesus came up to me and told me that my way of life was getting in the way of like the great change that needs to happen. So that's kind of another one that sat with me. I feel like that's maybe in the spirit of what Beth was talking about. Would that be a description of the Ignatian imaginative approach? Great, maybe I have then.